The bitter wind howled through the empty streets of downtown, carrying snowflakes that danced like tiny daggers in the yellow glow of street lamps. A young lawyer pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he hurried home from another late night at the office. As a junior partner at his firm, these midnight walks had become routine, though tonight's particularly vicious cold made him question his dedication to the job. His breath came out in visible puffs as he navigated the familiar route, mind already drifting to the warmth of his apartment and the leftover soup waiting in his refrigerator. The sound of his leather shoes clicking against the frozen sidewalk echoed off the surrounding buildings, making him feel like the last person alive in this concrete canyon. That's when he heard it, a soft cough, barely audible over the whistling wind. He slowed his pace, scanning the darkness until his eyes fell upon a hunched figure tucked into the doorway of an abandoned storefront. The person was wrapped in what appeared to be little more than a thin cotton blanket, shivering violently in the sub-zero temperature. He found himself stopping completely, rooted to the spot by something he couldn't quite name. How many times had he walked past people like this, averting his eyes, telling himself that his monthly donations to the local shelter were enough? That someone else would help? That it wasn't his problem? Another violent shiver racked the figure's body, and he watched as they pulled their knees closer to their chest, trying to preserve what little warmth they had. The thin blanket was full of holes, offering almost no protection against the merciless cold. Without conscious thought, his fingers moved to the buttons of his coat. The expensive wool blend had been a gift from his parents when he'd made partner, their way of saying they were proud of him for following in his father's footsteps. It was the warmest thing he owned, and he'd spent more than one winter evening grateful for its protection against the elements. His hands hesitated on the final button as practical concerns flickered through his mind. He still had 15 blocks to walk. The temperature was well below freezing. He needed to be at work early tomorrow. He could get sick. But then he remembered something his grandmother had told him when he was young, shortly after they'd immigrated to America. She'd caught him hoarding his Halloween candy, refusing to share with his cousins. Kindness, she'd said in her careful English, is like a candle. When you light another's candle with your own, your flame doesn't become smaller. Instead, there is more light for everyone. The memory of her words warmed him from within, and he finished unbuttoning his coat. As he slipped it off his shoulders, the cold immediately bit through his dress shirt, making him gasp. How much worse must it be to spend an entire night out here? He approached the doorway slowly, not wanting to startle the person. As he got closer, he could see it was a woman, probably in her 50s, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her face was weathered, lined with stories he would never know, and her grey hair peeked out from beneath a tattered knit cap. She looked up at his approach, fear flickering across her features. The sight made his heart ache. How many times had she been harassed or hurt, making her afraid of any stranger who noticed her? "Here," he said softly, holding out his coat like a peace offering. "Please take it. It's too cold tonight." She stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, making no move to take the coat. I can't," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "You need it." He shook his head, taking another step forward. "I have more at home. And I'm not the one sleeping outside tonight." He draped the coat over the thin blanket, watching as her hands instinctively clutched the warm wool. "Stay warm," he said simply, offering her a small smile before turning to continue his walk home. He was aware of her eyes following him as he walked away, but he didn't look back. Something told him that would make her uncomfortable, might even make her feel obligated to refuse the coat. Instead, he hunched his shoulders against the wind and picked up his pace, his dress shirt offering little protection against the elements. By the time he reached his apartment, he was shivering uncontrollably, his fingers numb as he fumbled with his keys. But as he stepped into the warmth of his building, he felt something else too, a lightness in his chest that hadn't been there before, as if by giving away his coat, he'd also shed some invisible burden he hadn't known he was carrying. That night, as he lay in bed under his thick comforter, he thought about the woman in the doorway. Was she warm enough now? Had his coat made any real difference in the face of all her challenges? He fell asleep thinking of his grandmother's words about candles and light. The next morning dawned just as cold as the night before. The young lawyer layered 3 shirts under his suit jacket, knowing it wouldn't be nearly as warm as his wool coat, but determined to make do. As he walked to work, he took the same route as always, though he told himself it wasn't because he wanted to check on the woman. The doorway was empty when he passed it. The thin blanket lay discarded on the ground, but his coat was gone. He hoped that meant she'd taken it with her, that maybe it would help keep her warm as she faced another day on the streets. He picked up the blanket, holding it for a moment before carefully folding it and placing it in his briefcase. He could at least wash it and bring it back, in case she or someone else needed it. At work, his colleagues commented on his missing coat, eyebrows raised when he explained he'd given it away. "That was stupid," one of them said bluntly. "You probably just enabled her to buy drugs or alcohol. Besides, there are shelters for people like that." He thought about explaining that many shelters were full, that some weren't safe, that addiction was a disease not a moral failing, that anyone could end up on the streets given the right combination of bad luck and circumstances. Instead, he just shrugged and said, "Maybe. But I'm warm enough in here," and she wasn't. The day passed in a blur of client meetings and paperwork, but he found himself thinking about the woman repeatedly. He wondered about her story, what series of events had led her to that doorway. Did she have family somewhere? What was her name? He realized with a pang that he hadn't even asked. That evening, he left work earlier than usual and stopped at a nearby department store. He bought several warm blankets, some thick socks, and a new coat for himself, though he found himself gravitating toward the less expensive options, thinking about how the money saved could help others. Over the next few weeks, he began to notice things he'd overlooked before. The young man who sold newspapers on the corner, his fingers red and raw in the cold. The elderly woman who collected cans from trash bins, her shopping cart piled high with her possessions. The teenager who slept in the park, trying to look tough but failing to hide his fear. He started keeping granola bars and hand warmers in his briefcase. He learned the names of the people he passed each day, listened to their stories when they wanted to share them, respected their silence when they didn't. One morning, about a month after he'd given away his coat, he spotted a familiar figure huddled in the entrance of the public library. It was the woman from that night, wrapped in his wool coat, which now showed signs of wear but was still providing warmth. She looked up as he approached, and this time there was no fear in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For the coat." I've been wanting to say that." He smiled, sitting down beside her on the library steps. They exchanged names, and he offered to buy her coffee. She studied his face for a long moment, perhaps looking for signs of judgment or ulterior motives. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. Coffee would be nice. As they walked to the nearby diner, he noticed that she walked with a slight limp, an old injury, she would later tell him, from a car accident that had started her spiral into homelessness. Medical bills had drained her savings, and when she couldn't work, she'd lost her apartment. Her family had tried to help at first, but they had their own struggles, and eventually, the streets had become her home. Over coffee and warm breakfast, she shared more of her story. She'd been a teacher once, specializing in special education. She spoke about her former students with a warmth that transformed her face, making her look years younger. She told him about her dreams of opening a small bookstore, about the poetry she still wrote in a worn notebook she carried everywhere, about the daughter she hadn't spoken to in years. He listened, really listened, in a way he realized he rarely did anymore. When was the last time he'd sat down with someone and simply heard their story? When had he stopped seeing the humanity in every person he passed? That morning marked the beginning of a friendship that would change both their lives. He helped her navigate the complex system of social services, using his legal knowledge to advocate for her when necessary. He connected her with a local women's shelter that had a program to help residents find employment and housing. She, in turn, helped him see the world differently, to understand that compassion wasn't just about giving things away, it was about recognizing the dignity and worth in every person, about being willing to stop and listen, to see beyond the surface. Months passed, and spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter. The woman found a part-time job at a local bookstore, her knowledge of literature impressing the owner enough to overlook the gaps in her employment history. She moved into a small studio apartment, subsidized by a housing program he had helped her apply for. She began reconnecting with her daughter, tentatively at first, through letters and phone calls. The wool coat hung in her apartment's tiny closet now, no longer needed as a shield against the elements but kept as a reminder of the night that had changed everything. Sometimes, when he visited for their weekly coffee meetings, he would spot it and smile, remembering his grandmother's words about candles and light. One evening, almost a year after that cold night, the lawyer walked home from work along his usual route. The air was warm now, the streets filled with people enjoying the spring weather. As he passed the doorway where he'd first met the woman, he noticed a young man sitting there, his head bowed in defeat. Without hesitation, he stopped. "Hello," he said softly. "Would you like to get some coffee?" The young man looked up, surprise and wariness warring on his face. But there was also something else, a tiny flicker of hope, like a candle flame in the darkness. The lawyer thought about his grandmother, about the woman he'd helped, about all the lessons he'd learned since that winter night. He thought about how a single act of kindness had opened his eyes to a whole world he'd been too busy to see before. He thought about how giving away his coat had somehow given him something far more valuable in return, the ability to see the humanity in everyone he met, to understand that we're all just people trying to find our way home. As he sat down beside the young man, prepared to listen to another story, he felt that familiar lightness in his chest. He realized that what he'd given away that cold night wasn't just a coat, it was the walls he'd built around his heart, the comfortable blindness that had allowed him to walk past suffering without seeing it, the illusion that his success made him somehow different or better than those who struggled. The young man began to speak, and the lawyer listened, understanding now that this was how change happened, not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through simple acts of human connection, through the willingness to stop and see each other, really see each other, as people worthy of dignity and respect. And somewhere in the city, the woman was closing up the bookstore, the keys jingling in her hand as she locked the door. She would go home to her small apartment, make herself a cup of tea, and work on her poetry. Later, she would call her daughter, their relationship slowly healing with each conversation. And hanging in her closet was a wool coat, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can light the way home. The story of the coat continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. The young man from the doorway would eventually find his own path forward, helped by the simple act of being seen and heard. He would go on to help others, remembering the night a stranger stopped to listen to his story. And the lawyer? He never did go back to being the person who hurried past suffering with averted eyes. His grandmother had been right, kindness was like a candle, spreading light without diminishing its source. Each time he shared his light with others, it seemed to grow stronger, illuminating not just their lives, but his own as well. Years later, when people would ask him why he'd given away his coat that night, he would think carefully before answering. It wasn't just about the cold, or the thin blanket, or even the woman shivering in the doorway. It was about recognizing our shared humanity, about understanding that we're all connected in ways we can't always see but can always feel. "I gave away my coat," he would say, "but what I got in return was the ability to see the light in others, even on the darkest nights. And that has made all the difference."